The river did not ask permission. It never had, not in 1924, not in 1951, not in the spring of 1973 when it climbed its banks again and spread across the low fields of Bremer County, Iowa, the way it had been spreading since before anyone alive could remember. The Cedar River flooded every April. That was not a surprise. That was not a disaster. That was simply the river doing what rivers do when the snow melts in the north and the rains come in from the west, and there is nowhere for all that water to go except down and then out and then across everything that sits below the level of its banks. The farmers of the bottomland had a word for it. They called it the mud season. They said it the way a man says a thing he has accepted but never made peace with. The mud season, as if the mud was the problem and not the solution to something nobody had thought to ask yet. Colt Varden was standing in it on the third Tuesday of April, 1973. He was 47 years old, broad through the shoulders, with hands that had been shaped by 30 years of farm work into something closer to tools than anatomy. His boots were sunk to the ankle in black alluvial silt that had been deposited overnight by water that had risen to just above his knees before it began its slow retreat. The field around him was not a field anymore. It was a lake in the process of becoming a floor, and the floor was made of something so dark and so heavy and so fine-grained that it looked almost alive in the flat gray morning light. He had walked out to the middle of his West 40 because he needed to see it for himself. He always walked out to the middle of it after a flood. His father had done the same thing, and his father before that. It was a ritual of assessment, a way of measuring the damage, of calculating how many weeks it would take before the mud dried enough to plow, and how far behind that would put him on planting. Except this morning, Colt Varden was not calculating damage. He was looking at the mud, really looking at it in a way he had not looked at it before. He reached down and pulled a handful of it from the surface and held it in his palm. It was cold. It was heavy in the way that only very fine material is heavy, dense, with particles smaller than the eye can distinguish. It was almost black. Not the reddish-brown clay of the upland fields to the east, not the pale, sandy silt of the road ditches, but black. Deep, rich, organic black, the color of ground that has been composting for 1,000 years. He brought it close and breathed in. It smelled the way good earth smells after a rain, the smell that farmers call petrichor, without knowing the word, the smell that means life and nitrogen, and the slow engine of decomposition turning dead matter into growth. He had been smelling this mud his entire life, and he had never once stopped to ask why it smelled that way. He let it fall back into the field. Behind him on the county road that ran along the northern edge of the West 40, a truck slowed. Harv Pruitt, who farmed the adjacent land upstream and had stopped farming his own bottomland 2 years prior, was leaning out his window with the particular expression of a man who considers himself to have already solved the problem another man is still standing in. He called across the distance between them something about the flood, something about the mud, something about the look on Colt's face that suggested he still thought the situation was something other than a straight loss. Colt lifted a hand in acknowledgement and did not turn around. The truck moved on. 300 yards up the road, Dex Briggs had already stopped his own vehicle and was standing on the gravel shoulder with his coffee thermos and his opinions, which he dispensed with the same efficiency and reliability that he dispensed John Deere equipment from his dealership in Waverly, 12 miles downstream. Dex was 51, prosperous, and certain. He was certain about equipment, and he was certain about land, and the thing he was most certain about was that the bottomland along the Cedar River was not worth the effort it cost to farm it. He watched Colt standing in the mud for a moment. Then he got back in his truck and drove toward town. He had a sales call in the morning and no time for a man who was still standing in something everyone else had already walked away from. The co-op in Waverly had been running the same conversation every April for as long as anyone could remember. The men gathered on Saturday mornings around the long counter near the seed bins, and they talked about the flood the way men talk about weather they cannot control and costs they cannot avoid. They traded numbers, they traded complaints, they compared damage. The bottomland farmers were the ones who came in late boots, still carrying traces of dried silt, faces carrying the expression of men who had already done the math and found it unsatisfying. Dex Briggs held court from his usual position near the far end of the counter, one boot on the lower rail, coffee in hand, delivering the verdict that he delivered every spring with the confidence of a man who had never been wrong about anything he himself had decided to believe. The upland ground is where the money is, Dex said. You cannot control a river, farm the hills, forget the bottoms. The bottom land is a liability dressed up as acreage. The men who had already abandoned their bottomland fields nodded. Harv Pruitt nodded. A man named Gerald Odom, who had sold his river parcel to a hunting club 3 years back and considered it the best decision of his adult life, nodded. Colt Varden stood at the other end of the counter and did not nod. He was not the kind of man who argued in public. He was not the kind of man who argued much at all, which was something he had inherited along with the farm and the notebooks and the particular quality of attention that his father had possessed the ability to observe a thing for a long time before deciding what it meant. He bought his seed and left. He drove the 12 miles back to the farm on roads still marked at the edges with the high water lines of the flood pale stripes of dried silt on the fence posts, and the lower planks of wooden bridges, the river signature on everything it had touched. He pulled into the barn and sat for a moment with the engine off. Then he went into the barn office. The barn office was a small room that his father had built in the northwest corner of the main structure with a single window that looked out over the West 40. It was not much of an office. It had a wooden desk, a metal filing cabinet, a shelf of seed catalogs, and extension service bulletins going back to the late 1940s. It smelled of oil and old paper and the particular dusty sweetness of stored grain. His father had worked in this room for 40 years. August Varden had been a quiet man, not the theatrical quiet of men who are suppressing something dramatic, but the genuine quiet of a man who found that silence was usually more accurate than speech. He had farmed the same 120 acres since 1923, the year he bought the place with savings from 6 years of working other men's land. He had never expanded. He had never contracted. He had simply farmed year after year with the patience and the stubbornness that the land seemed to require of the men who chose to work it. He had died in 1965 without a great deal of ceremony. A heart that had been working harder than hearts should work for, longer than hearts, usually last, finally stopped on a Wednesday morning in October, and by Thursday the county knew, and by Saturday half the church had been through the farmhouse kitchen, bringing food and condolences, and by the following Monday Colt Varden was sitting in the barn office looking at what his father had left behind, which was not much in the conventional sense. There was the farm itself. There was the equipment, the old farm mall that August had bought, used in 1954 and maintained with a devotion that bordered on the religious. There were the animals, the accounts, the equipment manuals filed in the cabinet with the methodical precision of a man who believed that things left in their right places had a better chance of being useful. And there was the notebook. It was in the second drawer of the desk, between a folder of soil receipts and a manual for a cultivator that Colt was fairly certain no longer existed. It was a composition notebook, the kind that cost 15 cents at the hardware store, black and white marbled cover, ruled pages, the kind of thing a student carries to a classroom. Except this one was filled not with schoolwork, but with 40 years of observation. August Varden had started it in 1924, the spring after he bought the farm. Every April after the Cedar River flood receded from the west, 40, he had recorded 4 things: the date the water arrived, the date it receded the maximum depth on the field, and a description of the mud it left behind. 41 years of entries, 41 floods. Colt had found it in 1965 and read it, and then put it back in the drawer and continued farming the way everyone farmed, which was to say he cleaned up the mess planted late and hoped for a good season. He had not thought much about the notebook. He had thought about it the way you think about a thing that seems significant, but whose significance you cannot quite locate. He had continued his father's entries. Not because he had a plan, not because he understood why his father had kept the record, but because it seemed like something August would have wanted continued, and because Colt Varden was the kind of man who finished what his father started. By 1973, the notebook contained 48 years of data. He had never read it straight through. He had added his entries each spring and returned the notebook to its drawer, a ritual without a conclusion. On the Tuesday morning after the flood of April 1973, standing in his barn office with the West 40 visible through the window, still sheeted with drying mud, Colt Varden opened the notebook to the beginning and read it from start to finish for the first time. It took him most of the morning. The entries were spare. August was not a man for elaboration. Dates, depths, descriptions. But the descriptions were where you could hear him thinking. April 1931, he had written, mud dark, heavy smells, rich 2 thumbs thick on fence rails. April 1938, mud darker than usual, deepest deposit in recent years, stands on boots like paint. April 1947, mud lighter, more sandy, less smell, thin layer. April 1953, very dark, very heavy, strongest smell in years. August had been grading the mud the way a doctor grades a patient, noting the variations, observing the patterns building over decades, a record of something he did not yet have the scientific language to name. Colt read through the years. He recognized the floods he had witnessed himself, the high water years when the West 40 stayed under for 3 weeks, the dry years when the flood was shallow and brief and the mud deposit was thin. He saw his own entries beginning in 1966 and recognized in them the same attention his father had paid, the same noting of color and texture and depth, the same spare language of a man who is recording what he sees without yet knowing what it means. He reached the last page with August's handwriting. It was not an entry, it was something else. It was written in the fall of 1964, months before August died, in a hand slightly less steady than the earlier entries, as if age had finally begun to make its claim on the precision that had distinguished everything else in the book. August Varden had written this: I have been keeping this record for 40 years, and I have come to believe that the mud this river leaves behind is not a liability. It is the richest soil I have ever touched, darker and heavier and more alive smelling than the upland ground. And the soil tests I have done in my head by hand, by smell and feel and observation across 4 decades tell me there is something in this material that we are wasting every spring by scraping it into ditches. I thought about this for a long time before I said anything. In the spring of 1952, I mentioned it at the co-op. I said I thought the flood mud might be worth something, might be worth saving, somehow might even be worth building on. Gerald Odom laughed. Dex Briggs, Sr., said I had been standing in the water too long, and it had softened my thinking. The room went quiet in the way rooms go quiet when a man has said something that everyone has decided to agree is foolish. I did not bring it up again. I kept the record, I kept watching, I kept thinking about what I was seeing, because the mud told me every year that I was right, but the room told me I was wrong. And I did not have the courage or the proof to stand in the gap between those 2 things alone. If you are reading this, it is probably Colt. The river takes, but the river gives. I believe this. I believed it for 40 years, and I never did anything about it because I was afraid of the room. That is the truth of it. I was afraid of the room. Do not be afraid of the room. Colt read that passage 3 times, He sat for a long time after. The West 40 dried slowly in the April light beyond the window. A killdeer was working the mud flats at the edge of the field, probing for whatever the flood had surfaced. August had known. Not a hunch, not a casual observation, but 40 years of systematic knowing that he had carried alone, because one afternoon in 1952, a room full of men had laughed, and August Varden, who was brave in almost every other dimension of his life, had not been brave enough to stand in front of that laughter and keep talking. He had left the knowledge to his son. He had left it in the form of a question: do not be afraid of the room. Colt closed the notebook. He went to the kitchen and told Nell he needed to drive to Ames. Nell Varden was 45 and had been reading her husband's silences accurately for 20 years. She did not ask why. She asked if he wanted coffee for the road. He said yes. She poured it into the thermos, the blue one with the dented side that had been making the trip to Ames and back since 1961, and she handed it to him without a word that would have cluttered what she could see was working itself out in his head. He drove the 90 miles to the Iowa State University Extension Soil Laboratory with 3 mason jars in a paper bag on the passenger seat. The jars contained soil samples from the flood deposit on the West 40. He had collected them that morning before the mud had fully dried, scooping them from 3 different locations across the field. Noting the depth of the deposit and the color and texture at each location. 2 of the jars held material from the deepest deposits, which were the darkest and heaviest. One held a sample from a shallower area near the field's eastern edge, where the flood water had been faster and the deposit thinner. The technician at the extension lab was a young man named Briggs, no relation to Dex, who received the jars with the professional neutrality of someone who processed dozens of soil samples a week and had learned not to make predictions before the numbers came back. Colt explained where the samples came from. The technician wrote it down. Colt paid the processing fee and drove home. The results came back 22 days later. He opened the envelope at the kitchen table, Nell standing at the counter with her back turned, not watching, giving him room. He read the numbers once, then he read them again. Organic matter, 7.2%. The county upland average was 3.8. The flood mud from his West 40 had nearly double the organic matter of the best upland ground in Bremer County. Available nitrogen, 142 pounds per acre. The upland average ran around 80. The flood mud had 78% more nitrogen than the field's Dex Briggs sold equipment to work. Phosphorus, 61 parts per million. Upland average was 29, more than double. Potassium, 218 parts per million. Upland average was 145, 50% higher. Soil structure was classified as silt loam, which the report noted was ideal for vegetable production. At the bottom of the report, the technician had written a note by hand: excellent alluvial deposit. Comparable to prime river delta soils. Colt sat with that paper for a long time. The silence in the kitchen was the kind of silence that precedes certainty. The quiet of a man assembling the last pieces of something he has been building toward without knowing it. His father's 41 years of observation. His own 8 years of continued record keeping. The smell of the mud he had noted every spring without ever asking why it smelled that way. The color that was wrong for Iowa. Dirt too dark, too rich, too much like something from a river delta rather than a Midwestern farm field. The report said what August had suspected for 40 years. The mud was not a liability. It was a delivery. Every spring, the Cedar River was carrying the finest soil particles from hundreds of miles of watershed upstream, the accumulated organic matter of forests and fields and wetlands, all of it lifted and transported and then deposited for free on the lowest and slowest points of the floodplain, which was to say on Colt Varden's West 40. Every other farmer along the Cedar River was treating this delivery as a problem. They were scraping it into ditches, they were pushing it back toward the water, they were cursing the mud and spending weeks removing it so they could get back to the ground underneath, which was poorer by comparison and always would be. They were throwing away the best soil in Iowa, Colt made a copy of the report at the hardware store in Waverly. He drove to the co-op on a Saturday morning when he knew the room would be full. He did not make a speech. He did not explain himself. He walked to the bulletin board near the seed display, pinned the report to the cork with a single thumbtack, and walked back out to his truck. He was in the cab with the engine running when he saw through the plate glass window of the co-op Dex Briggs move to the bulletin board, read the paper, and pull it down. He watched Dex look at it for another moment. Then Dex crumpled it and dropped it in the trash can beside the seed counter. Colt put the truck in gear. He had the copy in his jacket pocket. He did not need the original. What happened next is what he told Nell about that evening at the dinner table, not dramatically, not with the energy of a man who has won an argument, but with the quiet certainty of a man who has confirmed what he already knew and is now simply deciding what to do with it. He told her he was going to build raised beds from the flood mud. He told her the plan the way a farmer describes a plan in terms of materials and time and equipment. 3 feet high, 20 feet wide, 100 feet long, 12 beds, 8-foot channels between them for drainage, built from the alluvial silt deposited by the flood, which the soil report had just confirmed was the richest dirt in the county. Nell listened. She asked one question. She asked how high the worst flood they had on record had gotten on the West 40. 32 inches, Colt said. 1951. She thought about that. 3 feet is 36 inches, she said. Yes, he said. She got up and poured coffee. That is what Nell Varden's support looked like. It did not look like enthusiasm. It did not look like cheerleading. It looked like a woman who had just heard a plan she understood, checked the single most important number in it, found the margin adequate, and moved on to the next thing. She was not a woman who wasted energy arguing with arithmetic. Colt went back to the barn office that night. He opened the notebook to the beginning and worked through it systematically, pulling out every flood depth measurement across 48 years. He made a list. He calculated the average. He noted the outliers. The average flood on the West 40 over 48 years was 17 inches. The maximum was 32, the 1951 flood, which old-timers still referenced as the benchmark of bad years. The minimum was 6 inches a dry year in 1936 when the snowpack had been thin and the spring rains had come late. 3 feet of height gave him a 4-inch margin above the worst flood on record. It was not a comfortable margin. If the Cedar River ever exceeded 32 inches on his West 40, the beds would go under. But in 48 years of records, it had not exceeded 32 inches. And those 48 years included droughts and deluges and everything in between years, when rivers elsewhere in Iowa had broken previous records by significant margins, and the Cedar at this particular bend had still come in below 32. The data was not a guarantee, but it was the best argument available, and Colt Varden was a man who worked from the best argument available rather than waiting for certainty that the land never provided. He wrote the numbers down on the back cover of the notebook. He went to bed. In the morning, he started building. The Farmall was a 1954 M that August had purchased used, and Colt had maintained with the same careful attention his father had applied to everything mechanical on the farm. It was not a young machine, but it was honest. It started in cold weather, and it pulled in low gear without complaint, and its rear-mounted blade could push the heavy alluvial silt with the slow patience that the work required. The alluvial silt, when freshly deposited and still wet, was like something between concrete and clay, almost impossible to work. It stuck to the blade and to the tires and to everything it touched. But Colt had timed the work for 2 weeks after the flood, when the sun and wind of late April had dried the surface enough to support the tractor's weight without sinking and had reduced the stickiness of the material to something workable. He began at the southern end of the field and worked north. Each bed required approximately 12 loads of material from the Farmall blade. He pushed the silt from the surrounding area into long parallel mounds, shaping each one with the blade and then with a hand rake, aiming for a profile that was 3 feet at the center crown and sloped gently to ground level at the edges, 20 feet wide, 100 feet long. The channels between beds were 8 feet across, enough for the tractor to pass through, and enough to carry floodwater without backing up. It was slow work. The tractor moved in low gear with smoke rising from the stack. The field was still wet enough in the lower spots to make the going difficult, and Colt lost half a morning early in the first week to a rear wheel that sank too deep in a depression he had not seen coming. He had to dig it out by hand, which took 2 hours and produced the kind of mud that coats a man completely and does not wash out of clothing. He was working alone. Harv Pruitt stopped on 3 separate occasions during the first week. Each time he stood at the edge of the field for a few minutes and watched, and each time he shook his head with the expression of a man watching something he considers both admirable and misguided, the expression of someone who has already made his decision and cannot quite decide whether to pity the man who made a different one. On the 3rd visit, Harv called across to Colt that the mounds looked like a graveyard. Colt stopped the tractor. He looked at the 5 completed beds behind him, the rough brown mounds still wet in places, uneven, some of them steaming faintly in the cool morning air where the dark material was releasing the heat it had absorbed from the previous day's sun. They did look like something you might find in a very large and poorly maintained cemetery. Come August, Colt said they will look like a garden. Harv shook his head and drove on. Nell brought lunch out to the field on the days Colt was working the lower end, which was far enough from the farmhouse that walking back in the middle of the day cost more time than it was worth. She drove the old Ford pickup to the field edge and left a paper bag on the hood, and did not stay, because she understood that Colt worked better without an audience, and that the best thing she could do for what was happening in that field was keep the house running smoothly so that he could stay out there as long as the light held. Dex Briggs drove past on Monday and Wednesday of the 2nd week. He did not stop. But both times Colt saw the truck slow as it passed the West 40, and both times he saw the shape of a man's attention turning toward the field before the truck picked up speed and continued south. Dex was looking. Whatever he was thinking, he kept it to himself. The co-op crowd had largely moved on to other spring concerns by the 2nd week of May. The flood was old news. The bottomland farmers were doing what they always did, waiting for the mud to dry and planning their late planting. The upland farmers were already in their fields. The conversations at the co-op had shifted to seed prices and fuel costs and the long-range forecast for the summer. Nobody came to help Colt build his beds. Nobody came to watch after a while. He was alone with the farm all and the silt and the 48 years of numbers in the back of the notebook and his father's voice on the last page saying, "Do not be afraid of the room." The room in April 1973 was not afraid of him either. The room had Dex Briggs and his 30 years of certainty about upland ground. It had Harv Pruitt and his abandoned bottomland and his quiet conviction that the river was an adversary you accepted by retreat. It had the weight of every generation before them that had cursed the April mud and scraped it into ditches and planted late and hoped. But the room did not have the notebook. The room had never had the notebook. The notebook was August Varden's life work, 41 years of watching a thing that everyone else was too busy cursing to observe, and it was Colt's inheritance, and it was sitting in the barn office drawer with 48 years of data in it, and every single year of data said the same thing. The river takes, but the river gives. By the end of the 2nd week of May, Colt had completed 10 of the 12 planned beds. His hands were rougher than they had been in years, the kind of roughness that comes not from ordinary farm work, but from the particular friction of pushing a blade through wet silt hour after hour and then raking and shaping by hand. His back had lodged a formal complaint that he was managing with the combination of aspirin and stubbornness that had served him through 20 years of heavy farm work. The beds were beginning to look like something. not like a garden yet, not like anything that would make a man stop his truck and reconsider his position, but like a structure, like something that had been built with a plan behind it rather than simply pushed into piles. The long parallel mounds ran north to south across the southern half of the West. 40, their crowns roughly level, the channels between them straight and even. From the county road, if you stopped and looked, you could see that this was not random. You could see that someone had calculated something. Colt finished the last 2 beds on a Thursday. He stood at the northern end of the field in the late afternoon and looked south along the row of 12 mounds. They were still rough. They would need a month of settling and weather to develop the surface he would eventually work. But they were done. He was standing there when he heard a truck slow behind him. He did not turn around immediately. He stood for another moment looking at what he had built. 12 raised beds from river mud that cost nothing except time and effort, built on 48 years of data that nobody had asked for and nobody had valued, sitting in a field that half the county thought was a waste of time on land that the most confident voice in the county had repeatedly declared unfit for serious farming. He turned around. It was not Dex Briggs. It was Harv Pruitt again, window down, looking at the completed line of beds with an expression that Colt had not seen on his face before. It was not pity. It was not dismissal. It was something more complicated than either of those things. Something that sat in the neighborhood of recognition. The expression of a man who is looking at a finished thing and running the math on his own decision to quit. Harv looked at the beds for a long time. Then he looked at Colt. He said, "Your father used to say something about this river." Colt said, "Yes." Harv waited. Colt said, "The river takes, but the river gives." Harv was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "He was a patient man, your father." "He was," Colt said. Harv put the truck in gear. He did not say anything else. He drove north toward his own land, which sat above the floodline and produced average yields on average soil, and had never in its history delivered anything for free. Colt watched the truck go. He turned back to his beds. He had 1 month before he could plant. 1 month for the silt to settle and dry for the surface, to develop the workable texture he would need for seeding and transplanting. 1 month to wait and to let the thing he had built become the thing he needed it to be. He was not afraid of waiting. His father had waited 41 years. He could wait a month. Good. He walked back to the tractor at the south end of the field and started the drive back to the barn, moving slowly up the channel between beds. 7 and 8. The farmall's rear wheels, leaving clean tracks in the drying silt, the evening light coming across the fields from the west in the long horizontal way. It comes in May in Iowa, making everything gold and temporary and enormous. The notebook was in the barn office. The numbers were still there. The mud was drying. And the river, 1,200 yards to the east, was dropping back toward its banks, the way it had been dropping every April for longer than any record could account for, returning to its ordinary channel, taking with it the sand and the gravel and the coarse material it had picked up in the fast water upstream, leaving behind on Colt Varden's West 40 the finest and richest fraction of everything the watershed had to offer, leaving it the way it had always left it, not as a disaster, as a gift that nobody had known how to keep until now. The beds sat in the May sun and dried. Colt watched them every morning from the kitchen window while he drank his coffee the way a man watches something he has committed to, not with anxiety exactly, but with the particular attention of someone who understands that the next phase of a thing depends on conditions he cannot fully control. The weather had to cooperate. The silt had to behave the way he believed it would behave based on what he had observed over years of watching his father's flood deposits dry in the field. The material had to transform from the heavy plastic unworkable paste it was immediately after the flood into something with enough structure to hold a blade and accept a seed. It took 16 days. He knew it was ready on a Thursday morning when he walked out to bed number 1 and pressed his boot heel into the surface and felt it give only slightly, the way good worked ground gives, with resistance and spring rather than the slow subsidence of material that has not yet found its shape. He knelt and broke the surface crust with his fingers, and found beneath it a layer of silt that crumbled the way it was supposed to crumble into small, irregular pieces that fell apart when he pressed them between his thumb and forefinger and left a dark stain on his skin. He stood up and looked down the line of 12 beds. They had changed in 16 days in the way that only agricultural material changes when it is drying, losing its formlessness, acquiring definition, the crowns leveling and firming the surfaces, developing the pale gray skin of dried silt that covered the darker and more workable material beneath. They were still rough. They were still, if you were being honest, not obviously different from the kind of thing a man might push up with a blade in an afternoon without particular intent. But they held their shape. They had not slumped or cracked or failed in any of the ways that Colt had considered might be possible. He went back to the barn and got the hand rake. He worked bed number 1 from one end to the other, breaking the dried surface crust and turning it into the layer below, combining the pale dry material with the darker moist material beneath it. The result was a surface that smelled of rain and iron and the deep organic richness that he had noticed in the flood deposit in April. He worked methodically, not fast the way his father had worked everything. Because August Varden had believed that speed was the enemy of observation and that the best farmers were the ones who moved slowly enough to notice what they were working with. What he was working with was extraordinary. He could feel it through the rake. The way the material responded, the slight resistance that indicated structure without the hard resistance that indicated compaction, the way it broke cleanly rather than tearing, the way it settled behind the rake into a surface that looked already like something that had been prepared. He had worked Iowa soil his entire adult life, and he had never worked anything quite like this. He raked compost from the barn pile into the surface of bed 1, not because the alluvial silt needed it for fertility, the lab numbers had made that clear, but because he wanted to improve the drainage characteristics of the fine-grained material, to open it slightly, to give it the aeration that very fine soils sometimes lack. He worked it in by hand on his knees at the northern end of the bed, the way a gardener works rather than the way a row crop farmer works, which is to say slowly and with attention to texture rather than quickly and with attention to time. Nell had started the tomato seedlings in the kitchen window in March. She had done this every year for 20 years, starting seeds in small pots on the south-facing kitchen windowsill 6 weeks before the last frost date, the way every farm wife in the county did, the way her mother had done and her mother's mother before that. What was different this year was the quantity. She had started 60 tomato plants instead of the usual 20. She had started 40 pepper plants. She had started 30 melon hills in individual pots, the kind of commitment to transplanting that implied serious acreage rather than a kitchen garden. She had done this without being asked. Colt had noticed the seedlings accumulating on the windowsill and the card table. She had moved next to it to handle the overflow and had not commented. Nell Varden operated from her own assessment of situations. Her assessment of this situation was that the beds would be ready and that more plants would be needed than the usual supply, and that someone needed to make sure the supply existed when the time came. She had been right, as she was usually right about things she had quietly decided. The tomato transplants went into the bed centers in early June, the melon hills between them, the pepper plants staggered along the inner edges. Colt direct seeded the outer portions of each bed with sweet corn on one side and cucumbers and green beans on the other. The planting took 3 days, working methodically from bed 1 to bed 12, adjusting the spacing as he went, reading the surface of each bed as he planted it, noting the slight variations in texture and moisture that told him which areas would need watching and which were ready to go. He planted on his knees for most of it. That is something worth understanding about what Colt Varden was doing in those early June days of 1973. He was a row crop farmer, had been one his entire adult life. Row crop farming is conducted largely from the seat of a tractor. You plant from a tractor, you cultivate from a tractor. Your relationship to the soil is measured in acres per hour and bushels per acre, and the mathematics of input costs versus commodity prices. You do not, as a rule, spend 3 days on your knees in a field that covers less than an acre of planted surface. But Colt was not thinking about this as a row crop operation. He was thinking about it as something closer to what his father had been gesturing toward in the last entry of the notebook. Something that worked with the river rather than against it. Something that treated the flood deposit not as an interruption to farming, but as the primary input of the system. That kind of farming did not happen from a tractor seat. It happened close to the ground with your hands in the material, learning what it was telling you. By the third day of planting, the material was telling him quite a lot. The most surprising thing was the temperature. He had noticed on the first day that the bed surfaces were warmer than the surrounding ground. Not dramatically warmer, not in a way that would register on an instrument as remarkable, but perceptibly warmer in the way that your hand knows when it moves from shade to sun. The dark alluvial silt was absorbing heat from the June sun with an efficiency that the paler upland soils could not match. By mid-morning on a clear day, the bed surfaces were warm to the touch in a way that his upland garden ground behind the house was not. He thought about what this meant for the seeds he had just planted. Seeds germinate when the soil temperature crosses a threshold that varies by species. Corn germinates when soil temperature reaches 50 degrees. Cucumbers need 60, melons need 65. The difference between 55-degree soil and 65-degree soil is not just 10 degrees of warmth. It is the difference between a seed that sits and waits and a seed that begins. It is a week of time, sometimes 2 gained or lost entirely, on the basis of how quickly the ground absorbs and holds the heat that the sun is offering. The alluvial beds were absorbing that heat faster, which meant the seeds would germinate sooner, the transplants would establish sooner, and the entire growing season on the beds would start 10 to 14 days ahead of what the upland ground could offer. Not because Colt had planted earlier, he had not. He had planted at the same time he would have planted anywhere else. But the soil was doing something the upland soil did not do. It was creating warmth out of sunlight with a capacity that was directly related to its organic content and its color and its density, all of which were functions of the flood deposit, all of which were functions of the river. He finished planting on a Friday and went to the co-op on Saturday. He did not say anything about the beds. He bought what he needed and listened to the usual conversations and drove home. Dex Briggs was there, as he always was on Saturday mornings, and he said nothing about the West 40, and neither did Colt, and between them in the room was the absence of the conversation neither was willing to start. That was fine. Colt was not trying to win a conversation. He was trying to grow something. What grew in the summer of 1973 on those 12 raised beds of alluvial silt was, by any standard that a farmer uses to measure a crop, extraordinary. The sweet corn came up in 7 days from planting 2 days faster than the same variety in Colt's upland garden behind the house. By mid-July, the stalks were 6 feet tall when they should have been 4 by early August. They were 8 feet tall, a foot above the same variety on his upland ground, with thicker stalks and darker leaves and ears that were heavier on the plant than anything he had grown in the upland soil. He pulled an ear from bed number 3 on a Wednesday in early August and stripped the husk and held it up in the morning light. And it was the kind of ear you tell people about, tight and deep and full to the tip with no blank rows, the kind of ear that represents what the plant was trying to do all along and only occasionally achieves. The tomato plants had outgrown their first stakes by late July. He had staked them in early July with the 4-foot wooden stakes he used in his upland garden, which had always been sufficient. By the last week of July, every plant in beds 1 through 4 had grown above the stake tops and was bending toward the ground under the weight of fruit. He drove taller stakes 6-footers alongside the originals and retied the plants. By mid-August, the plants in bed number 4 were brushing the tops of the 6-foot stakes. He counted the tomatoes on one plant. He counted from the bottom up, making a rough tally of every fruit visible through the dense foliage, the ones that were already red, the ones still green, the small late-season fruit coming in on the new growth at the tops of the branches. 63. He stood back and looked at the plant. His upland garden tomatoes averaged somewhere around 30 fruit per plant in a good year. This plant had more than double that. It had so much fruit that 2 of the main branches had cracked at the crotch under the weight and had to be supported with additional ties of baling twine to keep them from pulling away from the central stem entirely. He went down the row of bed number 4 counting plants. Every plant in the row was within the same range. 55 on the low end, 67 on the high. He stood at the end of the row and did arithmetic in his head and arrived at a number that he then refused to take seriously until he had walked the number back through the calculation twice more and arrived at it both times. He went back to the barn office and sat down. He pulled out a piece of paper and wrote out the math properly. 12 beds, each bed 100 feet long and 20 feet wide. Planted surface on each bed approximately 1,800 square feet at full density. Total planted surface across 12 beds, approximately 21,600 square feet, which was just under half an acre of actual planted ground, accounting for the channels between beds. The tomato plants at 60 fruit per plant average, with each bed running 40 plants per row at 2 rows per bed at an average fruit weight approaching half a pound per tomato. He wrote out the produce estimate for each crop separately and then added them. He sat with the total for a long time. Then he went and found Nell. She was in the kitchen canning, which she had been doing for 2 weeks at a pace that suggested she had seen this coming, even if she had not said so. The kitchen smelled of vinegar and dill and hot glass and the particular sweetness of cucumber brine that is one of the more specific and irreplaceable smells of an Iowa summer. He told her what he thought the beds would produce. She did not stop working. She lifted a jar from the canner with the rubber-tipped tongs and set it on the towel on the counter and listened. When he was done, she said, "Then we need a market." That is what Nell Varden said about a number that represented more gross revenue from half an acre than most bottomland farmers in the county cleared from 80 acres of corn. She said, "Then we need a market." She had, as it turned out, already been thinking about this. The Waverly Farmers Market ran every Saturday morning in the parking lot behind the feed store on the north side of town. Roughly 40 vendors. At peak season, mostly produce and preserves, and the occasional craft item, the kind of market that exists in every county seat in the Midwest, and supplies a steady small income to farm families willing to drive in early on Saturday and spend 4 hours behind a table. Nell had been selling pickles and preserves at the market for 6 years. She knew the customers. She knew which ones would drive across town for something they could not get at the grocery store. She knew which ones asked questions and which ones just bought and which ones told their neighbors. What she proposed was not just a table at the market. What she proposed was a story. She had painted the sign herself on a piece of pine board from the barn in the careful block lettering she used for everything she considered important. The sign read, "Varden Bottom Land, Flood-Grown Produce." Colt looked at the sign for a long time when she showed it to him. He said, "Flood-grown." She said, "People know what the bottomland is. They watch it flood every April. They drive past it on the way to town. When they find out the produce comes from there, from the flood mud, they will want to know why it is different. And then you can tell them." He understood what she was doing. The flood was not just a weather event in Bremer County. It was a shared experience, something the whole region knew, something that marked the calendar and dominated conversations every spring for as long as anyone had been alive. Every person who bought a tomato at the Waverly Market had watched the Cedar River climb its banks in April. Every person who drove past his West 40 had seen the water standing in the low fields. They knew what bottomland was. They knew what the flood did to it. Telling them that the produce grew in flood mud was not just information, it was an invitation into something they already knew and had never thought to reconsider. Nell had seen that in a way that Colt, who was thinking about soil chemistry and drainage calculations, had not. They set up at the market on the third Saturday in July. The table sold out by 9:30 in the morning. Not slowed down by 9:30, not beginning to thin out, sold out every tomato, every cucumber, every ear of corn, every cantaloupe. A woman from Cedar Falls who had driven 18 miles to Waverly for a different errand stopped at the table, read the sign, bought 8 pounds of tomatoes, and asked if she could come back the following week for more. Colt said yes. She came back the following week with her neighbor. The week after that, she brought 3 people from her church. By the 4th week of selling, Colt was arriving at the market at 5:30 in the morning to set up before the other vendors because customers were pulling into the parking lot at 6:45 to make sure they got there before the tomatoes were gone. A restaurant owner from Cedar Falls named Pittman drove out on a Wednesday afternoon, found Colt in the field, and proposed a standing order of 20 pounds of tomatoes per week cash, no negotiation on price required. Colt said he would think about it. He talked to Nell that evening. She had the account book open on the kitchen table, the small green ledger she used for all the farm income and expenses. And she had been entering numbers from the market receipts with the focused attention she brought to anything involving money. She looked up when he described the restaurant offer. She said, "Take it." He took it. By the end of the first summer, Colt had done the accounting. The 12 beds covering less than half an acre of planted surface had generated $3,200 in gross sales from the farmer's market, the restaurant account, and a roadside stand that Nell had set up at the end of the farm road on weekday afternoons. His 80 acres of upland corn had netted 4,800. He sat with those two numbers for a long time. Half an acre versus 80 acres, 3,200 versus 4,800. The beds were producing 67 cents of revenue for every dollar the upland corn produced on 1% of the acreage. That math did not fully compute the first time he worked through it. He had to write it out twice before he was willing to believe the comparison was accurate. It was accurate. The numbers did not change when he checked them. He went out to the West 40 in the late October afternoon after the harvest was finished, and the beds had been cleaned up and the spent plants removed and the surface raked back to the bare silt. The beds in October looked different from the beds in August. Without the plants, without the dense green canopy of high summer, they were just mounds again. Rough brown mounds of dark silt, lower than they had been in May because the material had continued to settle through the growing season. He walked the length of bed number 7, the middle bed, the one closest to the road. The surface was dark and fine and still faintly warm in the October sun. He knelt and picked up a handful and held it and let it fall through his fingers. His father had done this for 40 years and seen what it was. The room had laughed, and August had put the notebook in the drawer and planted corn like everyone else and died in 1965 without having done the thing he had written in the last page of his record that he believed could be done. Colt was not going to put the notebook in the drawer. He was going to build more beds. He spent the winter planning. He pulled out the notebook and went through the flood records again, not to calculate the bed height he had done that, but to look at the data from a different angle. He was looking at the channel deposits, the material that settled in the low areas between the beds during the flood, and then stayed there when the water receded. He had noticed after the 1973 flood, before he built the beds, that the deepest and richest deposits were always in the lowest parts of the field. The channels he had cut between the beds were by design the lowest parts of the field. They would act as collection zones for the flood deposit, which meant every future flood would not just refill the channels, it would deepen them. And if he shoveled the channel deposits onto the bed surfaces, after each flood, the beds would grow. They would accumulate material every year. They would get taller and richer and more productive, not by Colt's hand alone, but by the river's annual contribution. He had designed a system that fed itself. He was thinking about this on a February evening when Nell came into the barn office and stood in the doorway with the expression she used when she had something to report that she considered significant. She said the Iowa State Extension had called. A soil scientist named Garrett had read the lab report from the 1973 samples, which had apparently circulated among the Extension Service staff in Ames after the technician's handwritten note about Prime River Delta soils had attracted some professional curiosity. Garrett wanted to come out in the spring and look at the beds. He wanted to take his own samples. He was interested in what Colt had built and what the lab numbers suggested about the long-term productivity potential of managed alluvial deposits. Colt said, "Tell him to come after the flood." April 1974 arrived the way April always arrived on the Cedar River, without negotiation and without warning. Beyond the general expectation that it would come, the slow building of snowmelt upstream, the dark skies moving in from the northwest, the river beginning its rise 2 days before the water actually crossed onto the bottomland fields. Colt watched the river gauge at the county road bridge every morning. He had been watching it for 23 years. He knew the numbers that corresponded to different flood levels on his West 40. 12 feet on the gauge was when the water first touched the low edges of the field. 15 feet was a normal flood, the kind that left a standard deposit and receded in 10 days. 18 feet was a significant flood, the kind that stayed for 2 weeks and left a heavy deposit. 22 feet, which had only happened 3 times in the records he had kept and his father had kept before him, was a serious event. The gauge on the morning of April 9th read 14 feet and rising. On the morning of April 10th, it read 17 feet. On the morning of April 11th, it read 19 feet, and the water was standing on his West 40 to a depth he estimated at somewhere between 18 and 20 inches, which was already above the 1973 flood level and still rising. He drove to the county road and parked and got out and looked at the field. The water was moving slowly across the surface from east to west, carrying silt in suspension, the dark brown color of a river, in flood, not the muddy red of disturbed clay, but the dark organic brown of material that has been in motion for a long time and has picked up everything the watershed had to offer. The 12 beds were visible in the water. The tops of them were above the surface. They were the only things above the surface. They looked like long islands. He stood on the road and watched the water move around the beds and through the channels and across the lower areas of the field that he had not yet built up. And he thought about the 48 years of data in the notebook and the calculation he had made from it, and he waited. The gauge peaked on April 12th at 21 feet. 21 feet corresponded to a flood depth of approximately 22 inches on the West 40. His beds were 36 inches high. The water came within 14 inches of the bed tops. He checked every bed on April 13th, walking the field in knee-high rubber boots, with the water still at shin depth in the channels. Every bed surface was dry. Every bed surface had stayed above the flood. The water had moved around them and between them and through the channels as if the channels had been designed for exactly this purpose, which they had, and the beds had sat above it all with their 4-inch margin to spare, plus 10 additional inches beyond that. He walked the length of bed number 1. He knelt at the midpoint and pressed his hand against the surface, and it was damp from humidity, but not wet from submersion. The soil was intact. The structure of the bed was intact. The channel to his left had standing water in it, still water the color of strong tea, still carrying silt in suspension, still depositing the finest material in the slowest zones of flow. He looked downstream along the channel. The bottom was already covered with a layer of fresh, dark silt that had not been there before the flood. He could see it through the shallow remaining water, a thin, dark stripe along the channel floor that was distinct from the paler sediment of the channel edges. The river was filling his channels for free. It was doing exactly what he had calculated it would do. When the water fully receded 3 days later, he walked the channels and found deposits of fresh alluvial silt ranging from 4 inches deep in the upper channels to 6 inches deep in the lower channels, where the water had been slowest and had dropped the finest material. The material was the same dark, heavy, fine-grained silt that the lab had tested the previous spring. It smelled the same. It had the same color and texture. He shoveled it onto the bed surfaces 1 channel at a time, adding 1 inch to 2 inches of new material to every bed top. The beds were taller after the 1974 flood than they had been before it. They were richer. The system was working the way the data said it would work. Harv Pruitt came by on the day after the water receded, when the field was still wet in the channels and the bed surfaces were drying in the April sun. He stood at the edge of the field and looked at the 12 beds and at the thin layer of dark silt that Colt was shoveling from the channels onto the tops. He had lost most of his spring planting. The 1974 flood had covered his upland transition fields, the lower edges of the upland ground that he had moved his operation to after abandoning the bottomland, and the water had sat on them long enough to rot the seed he had put in early. He was looking at a replanting and a late season and a yield that would probably come in 30% below what a normal year would have produced. He looked at Colt's beds. He said they held. Yes, Colt said. How high did the water get in the channels? About 22 inches. He looked at the bed tops 3 feet above the channel floors. Harv was a farmer. He did not need the calculation explained. He stood there for a while. Then he said, "What are you going to plant this year?" Colt told him. Harv nodded slowly, the nod of a man who is recalibrating. Not dramatically, not with the theatrical quality of a conversion experience, but with the quiet internal shift of someone whose data set has just been updated by something that cannot be argued with. He said, "I might be interested in building a few beds on my lower ground. If you want to," Colt said, "I can show you how I calculated the height." Harv said he would come by later in the week. He came by on Thursday. Colt sat with him at the kitchen table and opened the notebook and walked him through 48 years of flood records, the average depths, the outliers, the calculation methodology. Harv was a good farmer, the kind who understood numbers and took them seriously, and he followed the logic of the calculation without needing it repeated. He asked 2 questions, both good ones, about the channel width and the drainage behavior under flood conditions. And Colt answered both from observation and from what the 1973 and 1974 floods had demonstrated. Harv left with the core calculation written on a piece of paper in his own handwriting. He built 4 beds that spring on the lowest ground of his property. They were not as tall as Colt's beds. He had not kept flood records for his specific parcel and was working from less data, so he had built conservatively at 2.5 feet rather than 3. They were adequate. They held in the 1975 flood. They produced well. But they were not Colt's beds because Harv did not have the notebook. He had the calculation, but he did not have 48 years of observation behind the calculation. 48 years of a specific field's flood behavior, recorded by a man who watched it with medical attention every spring for the better part of a half-century. The calculation Colt had given him was correct in general, but it was not specific to Harv's ground in the way that Colt's calculation was specific to the West 40. There was a difference between a calculation and a record. The record was the inheritance. The summer of 1974 confirmed what the summer of 1973 had suggested. The beds produced at the same level or better than the previous year, despite the larger flood which had brought a heavier deposit of fresh silt to the channel floors, and therefore a richer addition to the bed surfaces when Colt shoveled it up. The tomatoes were, if anything, larger and more numerous. The sweet corn was taller. The cantaloupe were running 8 to 10 pounds, now the flesh so dense with sugar that Nell had started canning melon preserves because there was more fruit than the family and the market customers and the restaurant in Cedar Falls could consume in a season. Revenue from the beds in 1974 came in at $4,100, $900 more than the first year from the same half acre. Nell added the number to the ledger and put the book away without comment. The numbers were their own argument. She did not feel the need to add words to what the numbers were already saying clearly enough. Colt was thinking about the second set of 12 beds. He was also thinking about the soil scientist named Garrett from Iowa State Extension, who had come out in May of 1974 and spent 2 days on the West 40 taking samples and measurements and photographs and asking Colt questions in the careful, interested way that scientists ask questions when they are looking at something that does not fit neatly into what they already know. Garrett had said on the afternoon of his second day, standing in the channel between beds 4 and 5 with a sample jar in each hand, I want to be honest with you, I have not seen anything quite like this in Iowa. The concept is well established in the literature going back to ancient Egypt and Southeast Asia. But this is the first managed alluvial raised bed system I have encountered in the contemporary Midwest, and the soil profile data suggests that what you have achieved here is a self-renewing fertility cycle that may be indefinitely sustainable without purchased inputs. Colt had listened to this. Then he said, "My father knew the mud was rich. He just did not know how to keep it." Garrett had looked at him for a moment. Then he wrote something in his notebook. Colt did not ask what. He found out years later when the graduate student came in 1991 and showed him the literature she had assembled for her thesis research, which included a note from Garrett's 1974 visit report that read, "Farmer demonstrates multi-generational empirical knowledge base, significantly preceding formal soil science, understanding of alluvial deposition dynamics. Recommend longitudinal study." They had been studying him for 17 years before anyone told him. He did not mind. The beds had been talking for themselves the whole time. By the fall of 1975, the revenue from the bottomland produce operation had exceeded the upland corn income for the first time. $5,100 from the beds against $4,600 from 80 acres of corn. Nell entered both numbers in the ledger one beneath the other and drew a line under them and wrote the total. Then she closed the book and put it on the shelf and made dinner. Colt sat at the table looking at where the book had been. He was thinking about his father. He was thinking about August Varden writing in the last page of the notebook in 1964, 1 year before he died, that he had believed for 40 years that the flood mud was worth something and had never done anything about it, because a room full of men had laughed in 1952, and how that failure of nerve had cost 40 years of production on half an acre that had been delivering the richest soil in Bremer County every spring as reliably as the seasons themselves. 40 years. He was not going to waste another one. He was going to build 12 more beds in the spring. He was going to expand to the northern half of the West 40, where the flood deposits ran deepest and the drainage was best. He was going to double the operation and take on a second restaurant account and add a wholesale arrangement with the food co-op in Iowa City that Nell had been corresponding with for 3 months. He was going to prove the notebook right completely and finally, and without any remaining room for argument. The river was going to keep doing what the river did, and Colt Varden was going to keep doing what he had learned to do. He was going to keep what the river gave. Every year, without fail, without apology, and without any further concern for what the room thought about it. The second set of 12 beds went in during the spring of 1976. Colt built them the same way he had built the first 12, with the farmall and the rear blade and the patience that comes from knowing exactly what you are doing because you have done it before and watched it work. The new beds occupied the northern half of the West 40, the section he had left unworked in 1973 because he wanted to prove the concept before committing the whole field. The concept was proven. The numbers from 3 consecutive seasons were in Nell's ledger climbing in a straight line that did not require interpretation. He committed the whole field. The northern section had slightly different drainage characteristics than the southern section. The ground fell away toward the riverbank at a gentler angle, which meant the floodwater moved more slowly across it. and deposited a heavier fraction of silt than the southern beds received. Colt had noticed this in the channel deposits after the 1974 and 1975 floods, the northern channels always carrying a thicker and darker layer of material than the southern ones. He adjusted the bed spacing slightly in the north, widening the channels by a foot to handle the greater volume of deposit and improve the drainage behavior during flood. He was not guessing at this. He had 3 years of observation in the new entries he had been adding to the notebook every April, continuing the record his father had started in 1924, and those 3 years of post-construction data told him exactly how the water moved across the modified field and where it deposited most heavily. The notebook was still working. It had never stopped working. By June of 1976, all 24 beds were planted, and the West 40 looked nothing like what anyone in Bremer County would have recognized as a conventional farm field. It looked like something between a market garden and a piece of deliberately shaped land, the long parallel mounds running north to south across the full width of the field, the channels between them straight and clean, the bed surfaces dark, with the dense plantings that Colt and Nell had been refining over 3 seasons into a system that used every square foot of the elevated surface at maximum density. Nell had evolved the crop mix based on 3 years of market data. She kept a separate record from the farm accounts, a smaller notebook that tracked not just revenue but customer behavior, what sold first, what customers asked for when something was unavailable, what they came back for specifically versus what they bought because it was there. She had been building this record since the first Saturday at the Waverly Market in 1973, and it had become over 3 seasons kind of market intelligence that no other vendor at the Waverly Market possessed because no other vendor had thought to keep it. Tomatoes sold first always. Customers arrived early specifically for tomatoes. The restaurant in Cedar Falls had increased its weekly order twice. The food co-op in Iowa City, which Nell had been supplying since late 1975, was requesting a higher volume than the first 12 beds could reliably produce. The second 12 beds would solve that problem. They planted the new beds with a heavier emphasis on tomatoes and melons, which commanded the highest prices and generated the most repeat business, and reduced the corn acreage slightly because corn at retail margins was less efficient per square foot than the high-value produce that customers were driving distances to obtain. Nell had done this math and presented it to Colt on a Tuesday evening in March with the same directness she brought to everything she considered settled. He had agreed without discussion because the math was correct and because he had learned over 30 years of marriage that Nell Varden's assessments of situations were worth more than his own instincts on anything that involved people rather than soil. August came to the West 40, the way August always comes to Iowa, with heat that sits on the land like a physical weight and a clarity of light that makes everything look more itself than it does in any other month. The crops on the 24 beds were at their peak, the tomato plants heavy and dark, the melon vines running the length of the channels, and back again the corn standing 8 feet and more along the outer edges of the beds in rows so dense and tall that they created a wall of green along the county road visible from a quarter-mile away. Colt was working bed number 7 on a Wednesday morning in the second week of August, picking tomatoes into the wooden crates that Nell loaded onto the truck for the Saturday market. He worked down the row methodically, turning each tomato in his hand before picking it, checking the color and the give, leaving the ones that needed another day and taking the ones that were ready. It was work he had done every summer for 3 years now, and he had developed the particular fluency with it that comes from repetition, the ability to move through a row quickly without looking like he was moving quickly. He heard a truck slow on the county road. He did not look up immediately. He had heard trucks slow on the county road every week for 3 years. Some stopped, some looked and moved on. He had grown accustomed to being observed and had concluded that the observation did not require his participation. He heard the door open. He heard footsteps on the gravel shoulder. He heard the sound stop at the edge of the field. He looked up. Dex Briggs was standing at the boundary between the county road gravel and the West 40, wearing the pressed khakis and collared shirt he wore to the dealership, his arms at his sides in a posture that was different from the crossed arm stance he habitually adopted when delivering opinions. He was looking at the beds, not at Colt, at the beds, at the plants, at the dense green architecture of what had been built on land he had spent 20 years describing as agriculturally worthless. He was 54 now. The certainty that had always structured his posture was still there because certainty, like Dex Briggs's, does not dissolve. It modifies. It accommodates new information through a process that looks less like revision than like expansion, the addition of a new room to a structure that otherwise remains intact. He was looking at the beds the way a man looks at something that requires him to add a room. Colt set down the crate and walked to where Dex was standing. They stood together at the field edge for a moment without speaking. The morning was already warm and the bed surfaces were doing the thing they did in August, sun radiating the stored heat of the previous day back into the air just above the soil level, creating the slight shimmer that Colt had noticed every summer morning and that he had come to think of as the field breathing. Dex said those beds held in the '74 flood. Colt said yes. Dex looked at the plants. He was doing the farmer's instinctive inventory, the automatic assessment of growth and density and fruit load that anyone who has spent time around agriculture cannot help performing in the presence of a crop. He said, "How tall is that corn?" Colt said 8.5 feet last week. Probably 9 by now. Dex was quiet for a moment. He said, "What did you gross off this ground last year?" Colt told him. He gave him the number directly without preamble, without the qualifying language that Midwestern men often use when the number is larger than the social context seems to permit. Dex did not respond immediately. He was doing the math. You could see him doing it, the slight internal movement of a man running a calculation, the beds, the acreage, the number Colt had given him. He was comparing it to what he knew about upland corn production per acre, which he knew precisely because he had spent 30 years selling equipment to upland corn farmers and understood their economics intimately. He said, "That's mud, Colt." Colt looked at the beds. He said, "It is mud. It is also the best soil in this county." Both things are true, Dex. The question is which one you pay attention to. Dex looked at his own hands. They were the hands of a man who had sold equipment rather than used it for most of his adult life, softer than a farmer's hands. But he had grown up on a farm and he knew what good ground looked like and what it felt like. And the beds in front of him looked and felt like ground that a man would have been glad to farm in any decade and under any conditions. He said, "Your father used to say something about this river." Colt said, "The river takes, but the river gives." Dex was quiet. He nodded once, the nod of a man who is closing a tab that has been open for a long time, paying a bill that he had been carrying without fully acknowledging its weight. Then he said he was right. He turned and walked back to his truck. He did not say anything else. He did not offer an apology because men like Dex Briggs do not traffic in apologies for positions they held publicly and revised privately. What he offered instead was the acknowledgement, 2 words, he was right, which was the maximum available expression of a man whose entire professional identity had been organized around certainty and who was now quietly in the middle of a Wednesday morning on a county road in Iowa, revising one of his longest held certainties in the only way he knew how. Colt watched the truck pull back onto the road and head south toward Waverly. He stood at the field edge for a moment. Then he went back to bed number 7 and kept picking tomatoes. He had a crate to fill before the light got too bright and the heat too heavy for morning work. The second 12 beds produced at a level that exceeded even Nell's revised projections. The deeper alluvial deposits of the northern section, combined with the 3 years of accumulated silt that the original 12 beds had been building on their surfaces, created growing conditions that outperformed the first season by a measurable margin. the tomatoes on beds 13 through 24 came in heavier than those on the original beds, the fruit denser and more uniform, the plants producing later into the season before the first frost called them down. Revenue in 1976 came in at $6,200. Nell entered it in the ledger with the same handwriting she had used for every other entry, the same undemonstrative precision that was her signature in all things. She did not celebrate. She did not need to. The number was its own statement. She closed the ledger and put it on the shelf. Colt saw her looking at the shelf for a moment after she put the book away. He knew she was thinking about the other notebooks on that shelf, the farm records going back to his father's time, the seed receipts, and equipment logs, and weather diaries that August Varden had kept with the same careful attention he had given to the flood notebook. A life recorded in composition books and ledger pages, the evidence of a man who believed that observation mattered, and that the things you noticed and wrote down were worth more than the things you noticed and forgot. Nell had her own notebooks now. Her market records and her customer ledger and the account book were their own body of observation, different from August's, but built on the same principle that a thing watched carefully over time reveals itself to the watcher in ways that a thing glanced at never does. She was a keeper of records, the way August had been a keeper of records. She had become, without either of them remarking on it, the second half of the system that the West 40 required the commercial intelligence that converted what the soil produced into the revenue that justified producing it. The flood provides the soil, Colt had said to her one evening in the fall of 1976. You provide the market, she had said, and the river provides both. He had looked at her. She said, the flood gave us a story. The story is worth as much as the soil, maybe more. People buy what they can explain to their neighbors. They can explain flood-grown produce. It gives them something to say. He thought about that for a long time afterward. His father had understood the soil. Nell understood the story that the soil was embedded in. Between the two of them, and with the river's annual contribution, the West 40 was becoming something that no one in Bremer County had a precise name for. Not a farm in the conventional row crop sense, not a market garden in the small-scale hobby sense, but something that combined the productivity of exceptional soil with the commercial intelligence of a business that understood its customers and the narrative that connected them to the product they were buying, flood-grown produce. The words were on every sign Nell made, every receipt she wrote, every label she attached to the canned goods she sold at the market through the winter months. She had turned the river's most reliable annual disruption into the primary marketing identity of everything they grew and sold, and the customers responded to it the way she had predicted they would, with curiosity and loyalty and the particular affection that people extend to something that tells a true story about a place they already know. The food co-op in Iowa City had started listing the origin on their produce signs. Varden Bottomland, Bremer County. Cedar River Alluvial. They were 22 miles from Iowa City, and their tomatoes were arriving there with a provenance statement that the co-op's customers, who were the kind of people who asked where food came from before they bought it, found both credible and interesting. A professor from the university had come out in 1977 to buy produce at the farm stand and had stayed for 2 hours talking to Colt about the soil chemistry and the flood management system. He had taken samples. He had sent a note 2 months later with some literature attached about alluvial agriculture in the Nile Delta and the Mekong and the ancient floodplain civilizations that had organized their entire agricultural economies around annual flood deposits rather than against them. Colt read the literature carefully. He was not surprised by it. He had arrived at the same conclusion his father had arrived at, and that conclusion turned out to be the conclusion that every agricultural civilization built on a river delta had arrived at independently across several thousand years of human history. The flood is not the problem. The flood is the supply chain. The people who understood this built the breadbaskets of their civilizations. The people who did not spent their energy fighting the river and lost the soil it was trying to give them. His father had understood this from observation. The Nile farmers had understood it from necessity. The difference was that August Varden had been laughed at in a co-op in 1952 and had put his notebook in a drawer, while the Nile farmers had no drawer to put things in and no co-op crowd to fear, only the river and the land and the need to eat. Necessity, it turned out, was a better teacher than the room. Owen Varden was 22 in 1977 and had been helping on the West 40 every summer since the first beds went in. He was built like his father, broad and patient, and inclined toward the kind of physical work that produces visible results, the kind of person who finds satisfaction in the evidence of effort left on a landscape. He had watched the system develop from the beginning, had helped with the 1973 construction. As a teenager, had run the roadside stand for 2 summers, while Nell managed the market table, had learned to read the flood deposits the way Colt read them, with the particular attention of someone who understands that what the water leaves behind is more important than the disruption of its arrival. He had not gone far for college. He had gone to the extension courses in Waverly and to the occasional lecture at Iowa State, but his education was primarily the West 40, and his father's notebook, which Colt had started sharing with him formally in the evenings, going through the flood records year by year, explaining the calculation methodology, showing him how the data from each year updated the picture that the previous years had built. The notebook was a living document. It was now 53 years old, 53 springs of observation on the same piece of ground, and every year it added another layer of understanding to the one beneath it, the way the floods added another layer of silt to the bed surfaces. Owen had his own notebook by 1978. He had started it the way August had started the original, with the basic flood observations, but he had added categories that August had not thought to include, categories that the modern extension service had given him language for. He recorded soil temperature by bed number, germination rates by crop, and location yield per square foot by bed flood deposit depth by channel position. He was building a more granular version of what August had started, a more precise instrument for the same fundamental purpose, which was to understand what the river was delivering and how to use it most effectively. Colt had watched Owen develop this without comment for 2 years. Then one evening he had taken the original notebook off the shelf and handed it to Owen. He said, "This goes to you when I am done with it." Owen had taken it carefully, the way you take something old and irreplaceable. He said, "When will that be?" Colt said, "When I am done with it." It was not a conversation about mortality. It was a conversation about inheritance, which is a different thing. Mortality ends. Inheritance continues. What Colt was telling Owen was that the notebook was not a keepsake. It was a working document that had been in continuous use since 1924 and would continue to be used by whoever held it, because the river had not announced any intention of stopping its annual delivery, and the beds required the data that the notebook contained to be managed correctly. The notebook was a tool. It passed from the hand that had finished using it to the hand that needed it next. Owen understood this. The graduate student came in the summer of 1991. Her name was Patricia Sen from the Soil Science Department at Iowa State, and she had been directed to the West 40 by the note in Professor Garrett's 1974 visit report, the recommendation for a longitudinal study that had sat in the Extension Service files for 17 years before someone with the right combination of academic interest and thesis deadline had found it and acted on it. She arrived with a soil corer and a notebook and a camera, and the professional diffidence of a young scientist who is trying to take seriously something that does not yet have a recognized category in her field. She spent 4 days on the West 40. She took 37 soil samples from various depths and locations across the 24 beds and the channels between them. She measured bed heights, channel depths, surface organic matter content, at multiple locations. She interviewed Colt for 6 hours across 2 evenings at the kitchen table, going through the original notebook year by year, recording the data in her own notes, asking questions that were sometimes technical and sometimes historical and once or twice philosophical in a way that surprised him. She asked him how he had known to keep the flood deposit rather than removing it. He said, "My father kept a record. The record said the mud was rich. I tested it, and the test confirmed what the record suggested. I built structures that could hold the deposit above the flood level so it would not wash away. The rest followed from those 3 things." She wrote this down. She asked him whether he had known from the beginning that the system would be self-renewing, that each flood would add material to the beds rather than destroying them. He said, "I calculated that the channels would collect material. I did not know until the 1974 flood proved it that the system would work as completely as it did. The calculation said it should work. The 1974 flood confirmed it. Those are different kinds of knowing." She wrote this down too. She asked him what he thought the most important factor was in the system's success. He was quiet for a moment. Nell was at the counter with her back turned. He said, "The notebook. Without the flood depth records, I could not have calculated the bed height accurately. Without the accurate bed height, the 1974 flood would have topped the beds and destroyed them. Without surviving the 1974 flood, the system would have been abandoned, and the whole thing would have been written off as a failed experiment. Everything depended on the calculation. The calculation depended on the data. The data was my father's life work." Patricia Sen looked at the original composition notebook on the table between them. She said, "And he kept it for 41 years without knowing what it would be used for." Colt said he knew what it was. He did not know what to do with it. That is a different problem than not knowing. She wrote her thesis over the following 18 months. It was titled "Alluvial Raised Bed Agriculture as a Flood Adaptation Strategy in the Cedar River Bottomland," and it documented what Colt had built and what the soil science behind it demonstrated about the long-term productivity of managed alluvial deposition systems. Her data showed that the beds produced yields 4 to 6 times higher per acre than conventional upland fields in the same county. Her soil profiles showed that the organic matter content of the bed surfaces had continued to increase year over year since the system was established, compounding annually as each flood deposit added new material to the accumulated layers below. Her structural analysis showed that the beds had increased in height by an average of 8 inches since construction built up from the silt that Colt and then Owen had shoveled from the channels onto the surfaces after each flood. The beds were taller, richer, and more productive in 1991 than they had been in 1973. Every flood had improved them. Colt read the thesis in the spring of 1992. He read it carefully, the way he read everything he considered worth reading, which was to say slowly and with attention to the places where the professional language was encoding something that experience had already told him in simpler terms. He found those places frequently. The thesis said things like net alluvial deposition rate exceeds annual erosion loss by a statistically significant margin across all bed positions. And he recognized this as the scientific translation of the river gives more than it takes, which his father had been saying in those exact words since before Colt was old enough to understand what a river was. He read the conclusion of the thesis. It said in the careful language of academic soil science that the Varden system represented a model of flood adaptation that inverted the conventional framework of flood damage mitigation, treating the flood event not as a disruption to be minimized, but as the primary productive input of the agricultural system. It said that the self-renewing nature of the alluvial deposit cycle suggested that a properly managed raised bed system in a bottomland environment could maintain or increase its fertility indefinitely without purchased fertilizer inputs. It said that the implications for floodplain agriculture in the broader Mississippi watershed were significant and warranted further study. Colt set the thesis down. He sat for a moment. Then he said to Nell, who was reading across the table, "She says it could work indefinitely." Nell said August said that in 1924. He looked at her. She said not in those words. But he said the river gives. That means it keeps giving. He was saying the same thing she is saying. He just did not have the footnotes. Colt thought about that for the rest of the evening. His father had been right. Not right in the way that a lucky guess is right, but right in the way that 41 years of careful observation produces rightness, a conclusion drawn from evidence accumulated so patiently and over such a long period that it had the weight of something close to geological fact. August Varden had looked at the same piece of ground every spring for 41 years and seen what it was, and what it was had not changed because no one in the room believed him, and what it was had not changed because he had put the notebook in the drawer instead of standing up in front of the laughter and continuing to talk. What had changed was that a man willing to stand in front of the laughter had found the notebook. Owen took over the farm in 1995. Colt was 69, which was not old for a farmer, but was old enough that the physical demands of the West 40 had begun to produce a kind of tiredness that sleep did not fully resolve. He handed over the operation the way farmers hand over farms, not in a ceremony, but in a gradual transfer of daily decision-making that happens over years, until the younger man is making all the decisions and the older man is occasionally consulted and mostly left to observe. He observed with satisfaction. Owen had expanded the bed system to 36 beds over the preceding several years, using the silt deposited in the original channels to build additional beds on the edges of the field, extending the system toward the river in the east where the flood deposits were deepest. The 36 beds covered most of the usable surface of the West 40. The channels between them had been running for 22 years and were themselves several inches deeper than they had been in 1973, cut into the field by the annual passage of floodwater in a way that improved the drainage characteristics of the whole system. The field had been shaped by the flood and by the work, each working on the other. Revenue from the beds in 1995 was $12,000. It was the most productive half acre in Bremer County, and the productivity came entirely from the soil that the river deposited on it every spring, managed by a system built on 48 years of data recorded in a composition notebook that cost 15 cents in 1924. Lena Varden was born in 1989. She grew up on the farm, the way farm children grow up, with a practical familiarity with the land and the seasons and the particular rhythms of agricultural life that cannot be acquired any other way. She went to the Waverly Market with Nell on Saturday mornings from the time she could walk. She helped in the beds from the time she was tall enough to carry a crate. She watched the April floods from the county road every year of her childhood, standing between her father Owen and her grandfather Colt, watching the water rise and the beds hold and the channels fill with the dark material that the river was delivering from somewhere upstream. Colt told her the story of the notebook when she was 12. He sat with her at the kitchen table and opened the original composition book and went through it from the beginning the way he had gone through it with Owen 20 years earlier, explaining the observation system that August had developed and the calculation methodology that had determined the bed height and the logic of the channel design. He told her about the soil test results and about the co-op and about Dex Briggs and about the 1974 flood and about what it had meant to watch 12 mounds of river mud sit above 22 inches of floodwater while every neighboring field was underwater. She listened with the focused attention of a child who is receiving something intended specifically for her. When he was finished, she asked him one question. She said, "Why did Great-Grandpa August stop?" Colt looked at her for a moment. He said he was afraid of the room. She did not ask what room. She was a farmer's child. She understood what a room full of men who had decided what was true could do to the man who disagreed. She said, "Were you afraid of the room?" He said, "Yes, but I had the notebook. The notebook was proof that I was right, and I had a copy of it in my pocket." When you have proof in your pocket, being afraid of the room is a luxury you cannot afford. She thought about this. Then she said, "I want to study the soil." He said, "Your great-grandfather would have liked that." She enrolled at Iowa State in the fall of 2007 to study soil science. She was 18 years old. Colt was 81 and had been farming the West 40 in a consulting capacity for 12 years, walking the beds on good days, sitting with Owen in the barn office on the days when walking was harder, going through the current notebook, which was now the 4th composition book in the series that had begun with August's original in 1924. 4 notebooks, 83 years of flood records on the same piece of ground. He died in the spring of 2008. Not dramatically, not in the field, the way farmers sometimes die in the stories people tell about them, but in the bedroom of the farmhouse on a Tuesday morning in April, in the 2nd week of the flood season, with the Cedar River running high outside in the West 40, doing what it had done every spring since 1924, filling with the water that would recede and leave behind another layer of the finest soil in the watershed. He was 82 years old. He had farmed the West 40 for 35 years. He had built 12 beds from river mud in 1973 and expanded them to 24, and watched his son expand them to 36, and handed all of it, the land and the system and the notebooks and the knowledge, to the generation that came after him, the way his father had handed it to him, in the form of a record and a saying and the particular kind of courage that comes from proof in your pocket. The funeral was at the Lutheran Church in Waverly, the same church where August and his wife had been married in 1929, the same church where the bottomland farmers of Bremer County had gathered for weddings and funerals, and the quiet ceremonies of a community that had been marking time against the same river for generations. Owen spoke. He was standing at the front of the church in the plain clothes that Iowa farmers wear to funerals, not uncomfortable in front of the congregation, which was large because Colt Varden had been a man who was known across the county for what he had built on the West 40 and what it represented, which was a specific and local proof that the thing everyone calls a problem is sometimes a resource that has not been correctly understood. Owen held a mason jar. The jar contained soil from bed number 1, the first bed Colt had built in 1973. Owen had collected it that morning walking out to the West 40 in the April light with the flood water still standing in the channels, the beds above it as they had been above every flood since the first one they survived in 1974, and scooping a jar full of the surface material from the crown of the oldest bed. The soil in the jar was dark, almost black, layered if you looked at it closely with the faint variations of color that corresponded to different years of deposition, different flood seasons, different contributions from the river upstream. 35 layers, one for each year since 1973. Each layer representing a flood and a deposit and a shovel load of channel silt added to the bed surface, and another season of growth on the richest dirt in Bremer County. Owen held the jar up so the congregation could see it. He said, "My father built 12 raised beds from river mud in 1973. The John Deere dealer called it a sandcastle. The neighbors called it a mess. The soil lab at Iowa State called it comparable to prime river delta soils. The river called it a delivery address and came back every April for 35 years to add another layer." He looked at the jar. He said, "This soil was not created by my father. It was created by the Cedar River, which has been creating it for as long as rivers create things, which is to say, since before anyone was here to notice. My father did not make this soil. He figured out how to keep it instead of throwing it away. That is the whole of what he did, keep it instead of throwing it away." He set the jar on the lectern beside him. He said, "My grandfather August wrote in the last page of his notebook that he believed for 40 years that the flood mud was worth something and never did anything about it because a room full of men laughed at him in 1952. He wrote, "Do not be afraid of the room." He wrote it for my father. My father read it and was afraid of the room and built the beds anyway. He had proof in his pocket and he built the beds anyway. That is the difference between my grandfather and my father. Not courage, exactly. Proof. My grandfather did not have enough proof yet to stand in front of the laughter. My father had the lab results and 48 years of data, and he stood in front of it anyway. Owen looked out at the congregation. He said, "My daughter Lena is studying soil science at Iowa State. She is going to understand the chemistry behind what my grandfather saw with his hands and what my father built with a farmall and a rear blade in May of 1973. The circle goes around. August observed, Colt built, I kept building. Lena will understand the science, and the river will keep delivering because that is what rivers do. And the only question that has ever mattered on the West 40 is whether the people standing in the mud are going to throw it away or keep it." He picked up the jar. He said, "My grandfather said the river takes, but the river gives." My father heard that and built beds. I heard it from my father and kept building. Lena hears it from me. The saying passes down, the beds pass down, the notebook passes down. He looked at the jar one more time. He said, "And every April, the river keeps giving." Lena Varden was in the front row. She was 19 years old in her first year at Iowa State, studying the science of the thing her great-grandfather had observed by feel, and her grandfather had built by calculation, and her father had maintained and expanded through 30 years of faithful work. She would spend her career understanding the chemistry of alluvial deposition, the nitrogen cycles, and the organic matter dynamics, and the microbial communities that make floodplain soil different from upland soil in ways that go deeper than the numbers that appear on a lab report. She would publish papers, she would teach, she would bring students to the West 40 every spring after the flood to show them what managed alluvial deposition looked like in practice, what 36 raised beds on a half acre of Cedar River bottomland could tell you about the relationship between a river and the land it flows through and the people who choose to work with it rather than against it. She would keep the notebooks. All four of them from August's original started in 1924 to the current volume that Owen was adding to every April, 83 years of continuous observation on the same piece of ground, the longest running flood record in Bremer County, and possibly in the state a document that had been called no document at all when it sat unknown in a barn office drawer, and that had become, when a man decided to act on what it contained, the foundation of something that had been producing food and revenue and proof on half an acre of Iowa bottomland for 35 years without a single dollar of purchased fertilizer. The West 40 still floods every April. Owen walks the county road in the second week of the month and watches the water rise across the field and move around the beds and fill the channels and deposit what the river has carried from somewhere upstream. He checks the flood gauge at the bridge. He reads the numbers against the data in the notebook. He makes his entry when the water recedes. He has been making entries for 29 years. The beds sit above the water the way they have always sat above it, higher now than they were in 1973 because 35 years of channel silt shoveled onto the surfaces has raised them 8 inches beyond their original height, pushing them further above the flood with every passing year, getting safer and richer simultaneously, improving in both protection and fertility through the simple mechanism of doing the same thing correctly every spring. Lena comes out when she can. She walks the beds with Owen the way Colt walked them with Owen and the way Colt walked them alone in the early years and the way August walked the field before any of them, without beds, without the system, just a man and his field and the mud, the river left behind. and the slow accumulation of observation that would eventually become in the hands of a son willing to act on it, the most productive half acre in Bramer County. The notebook is in the barn office. The fourth composition book in the series, nearly full. Now the entries going back to 1924 in August's careful hand and forward through Colt's entries and Owen's entries to the present spring, the present flood, the present deposit of dark alluvial silt in the channels between 36 beds that are 35 years old and still building. There is room for one more entry on the last page. There's always room for one more entry. That is the thing about a record kept faithfully over a long time. It does not end. It transfers. The hand that writes it changes. The flood that it records continues. The soil that the flood delivers keeps arriving year after year, patient and reliable and indifferent to whether anyone is watching, offering itself to the land the way it has always offered itself, asking only that someone be standing in the mud at the right moment, willing to reach down and pick it up, willing to see what it actually is, rather than what the room has decided it must be. Sometimes the disaster is the delivery, sometimes the mud is the gift, and sometimes the man who kneels in the floodplain while everyone else stands on dry ground is the man who sees what dry ground will never show you. Colt Varden saw it. His father told him where to look. The river did the rest.